Everybody, this is John from Pioneer Next MTG coming at you with the top 5 decks going into January of 2024 here at the end of December 2023. Now, there are a couple of picks that are a little bit subjective. Some of the decks like Boros Convoke or Mono White Humans have been doing not as well the last couple of weeks, so we've kind of moved them down the list. But they still are a rather large part of the format. Not saying that they're going anywhere, but, you know, the list has shuffled around them a little bit, so whether it be Rakdos Sacrifice, Gruul Midrange, Enigmatic Fires, Greasefang, Boros Convoke, all of those could be arguably among the top 5 decks in the format, but we're going with the list that we're doing right now. Now, one of the biggest beneficiaries of Karn the Great Creator being banned is Lotus Field Combo. Now, ironically, the Lotus Field Combo decks are moving closer to picking up some of the tricks from the Lotus Field Control decks, namely some amount of strict proctors and some amount of discontinuities. What this does is allow you to not have to sacrifice your lands, get a little bit further ahead on mana, and still do the ridiculous mana things. Now, in some ways, that is similar to what Arboreal Grazer does, but strict proctor is a little bit of an upgrade because, well, its trigger can be relevant in a lot of situations, whether it be the Amolia Combo, whether it be against Angels. There's a few other decks that this trigger can really hamstring, in addition to, you know, benefiting yourself by ignoring your own Lotus Field triggers. But the rest of the deck is largely the same of what it's been the last couple months, other than, you know, random copies of Tails and discontinuity to stifling the trigger along with strict proctor. You're still trying to get your copy of Lotus Field into play, copying it with Espion Stage, then kind of going nuts from there. Ultimately, using all of your tutors, all your draw effects to eventually find one of your copies of Chandra Hope Speakin', dome your opponent for 5, Balged Recovery, hit back, and then you get this loop where you have all 3 Balged Recoveries going, and you just eventually dome your opponent for infinite once you have an Omniscience in play. There is historically other ways to win, but that is the primary one, especially in the absence of Lair of the Hydra in this particular build, instead choosing to run Chandra as the main win con in the main deck. Now, the sideboard has been gravitating more and more towards this kind of hybrid control combo. There are some matchups where you just board out at your combo completely, especially against the hyper-aggressive decks that are focusing on shutting down your combo, and then just board in bombs like Zakama, Dragonlord Dramoka, a bunch of sweepers and removal, and just kind of outgrind your opponent like this weird Abzan mid-range deck. That has been kind of the direction the deck has been headed for quite some time. Notably, this deck is not fully on MTGA or Magic Arena yet. Mainly Hidden Strings is the main thing holding it back, although it is also missing Dragonlord Dramoka. But this is one of the few remaining decks not really at full power on Arena, and it will be coming soon at some point. As soon as Hidden Strings hits the platform, then Explorer will basically have become Pioneer. Number 4 on the list is Blue-White Control. Now, Blue-White Control finds itself in a rather interesting place in the meta. Now, it kind of adapted to be kind of the combo killer because of the mixture of cheap counterspells and early interaction, plus sweepers. It has a pretty reasonable Amolia matchup. It's one of the few top decks that have a really good Amolia matchup. And has reasonable matchups against Phoenix and an okay matchup against Rakdos. So it's kind of evolved into a solid tier 1.5 strategy. The praise upon the creature decks obviously preys upon Phoenix in the kind of the grindier games, but can just kind of get shoved to the wayside by the Rakdos build, though there are some cards it can have to counter it. The deck has not changed all that much. The most recent addition is Get Lost, Hallowed Moonlight as an adaptation to some of the Collected Company decks, most notably Amolia, and then a heavy emphasis on things like Temporary Lockdown. Once again, you need sweepers to be a little bit cheaper, and then you have Supreme Verdict and Firewall to kind of clean up, and then you have the dynamic duo of the Wandering Emperor and Teferi to kind of push you ahead. Most versions have been running the 60-card variant as it's a little bit dangerous to run the Orion variant when there isn't as many mid-range decks in the format, although you could still argue Phoenix and Rakdos midrange are both mid-range decks, but they do require specific answers fairly quickly now. So the 60-card version is kind of taken over as the main version, although the 80-card version of the Orion deck still does wander around. Sideboard is a mixture of counter spells and different go over the top threats, especially against the mid-range decks. Baneslayer, Lyra, Starnheim, Unleashed, very cards that can very much overpower decks like Rakdos, especially as they're boarding down on the removal. Chrome Host Shark kind of feeds in the same pattern. The rest of the sideboard is specific answers, Rest in Peace for Graveyard nonsense, Narset's Reversal when you're expecting what the heck is the card? Thought Distortion, Mystical Disputes for the blue decks, Tishana's Tidebinder as a random gotcha against your opponent, and basically a bunch of bombs to board in the mid-range mirrors when you're playing more of a battle cruiser Magic and your opponent's just going to tear your hand apart. You need to rely on one or two big threats to win the game. I think largely the most format warping deck there is right now, and that is Amolia Combo. Now, Amolia Combo is a card that revolves around the combination of Amolia, Wild Growth Walker. Eventually, Amolia gets to a 20, blows up the rest of the board, you swing and kill your opponent. Alternatively, you can also use Dina or Aetherflux Reservoir to dome your opponent, either by pinging whenever the triggers are going off, or Aetherflux Reservoir once you just get to 50 life to dome your opponent. The rest of the deck is built around finding your combo pieces and putting a slow, mopey beatdown plan into the game, into play, just to force your opponent to respect your game plan. You'll see different things, mostly Court of Calling, sometimes Collected Company in some of these builds. This version goes for a little bit more of a value plan, with Knight Errant kind of taking the place of Collected Company. But basically, you have Return to the Ranks, and then some ways to return Amolia. You just kind of try to outgrind your opponent in some situations, but you can also set up the combo quite quickly. Once again, very reminiscent of old modern combo decks of old, like Kitchen Finks, Viscera Seer, Murderous Redcap combo, or Heliod Ballista Spike Feeder combo. There's a number of infinite combo decks or nigh infinite combo decks in the modern format, most notable right now being Yawgmoth, but this deck does come from a long line of decks like that and is very creature centric. And ironically, at the RC down in Atlanta, it did a remarkably good job at beating the two decks that should have a good matchup against it, that are actually the top two decks in the format that we'll talk about in a minute, and only really kind of got dumpstered by Blue-White Control. But that said, this deck does have a lot of redundancy, Court of Calling for some instant speed shenanigans. So, and if you have a fairly skilled pilot, I could see people struggling with the more interactive decks that we'll talk about in a minute. Sideboard, plethora of different things, whether it be bullet creatures for matchups like Lotus Field Combo, whether it be Archon, Eidolon of Rhetoric, things that keep your opponent from only casting one card a turn, things that punish control for playing at instant speed, answers like Skyclave, things for punishing your opponent for casting expensive things like Redain, Negative Dusk's Shadow for the mirror match, Thoughtseize for disruption against combo decks, mainly Lotus Field Combo. Can also potentially bring it in against something like a Greasefang if you're afraid they're going to beat you down a little bit too fast. Scavenging Ooze helps in that situation as well. Haywire Might blows up random things, mainly things like temporary lockdown or leyline binding. Sometimes you'll see Remorseless Cleric for the very same reason. That is Amolia Combo, the number 3 most played deck in the format right now. Number 2, down from its perch, so to speak, is Izzet Phoenix. Now, Izzet Phoenix was kind of high off of the Grixis and Izzet kind of being combined into one. The Grixis decks have kind of receded a little bit. They're obviously very powerful, but, you know, the deck does wane and wax sometimes, especially with the presence of Rakdos in the format. This version is very much kind of the combo variant with Temporal Trespass, Galvanic Iteration. This is one of the cards missing on Magic Arena, so if you're looking for a port into Explorer, you unfortunately have to stick with a more fair version of Izzet Phoenix. Hence why I generally play the Grixis version on Arena, simply because you're not really missing any of the pieces. You don't have to worry about Galvanic Iteration plus Temporal Trespass, because that just doesn't exist right now. This version I thought was interesting because the 4 copies of Seagate Restoration allows you to run fewer lands while still having enough lands. Don't know how often you'll get to 7 mana, but this deck does have the ability to grind and draw a bunch of cards, so I could see this being a reasonable inclusion in the deck. The rest of the deck is nothing too crazy. 4 Ledger Shredder, 4 Picklock Prankster, for Arclight. This particular version runs 1 copy of Brazen Borrower, just as a random out to a lot of problems. And then the rest of your deck is a bunch of cantrips. Consider, Opt, Sleight of Hand, Interaction in the form of Impulse, and Lightning Axe. Very important against decks like Amolia Combo. And then the rest of your deck is, we've already kind of talked about. Sideboard, you need to have a bit of a juke plan. Mainly because people are going to have graveyard hate pieces against you. So Crackling Drake, Fabled Marebreaker, sometimes you'll see things like Saheeli or Chandra. Just different things you can bring in to kind of have a more fair game plan. Crackling Drake isn't the best, but it is a big flyer that your opponent basically says, suspend 1, you die, if they can't kill it, and they might have had to use a lot of your removal on other things. Some soft permission against various things, whether it be combo matchups, blue decks, Mystical Dispute, etc. You'll see a different amounts of permission. You can't bring in too many because, once again, you are a deck that wants to play a lot of sorcery speed to get your Phoenixes back, but you can't afford to play a little bit of a Drago game. 2 copies of a Braid, nice split card removal spell, also deals with annoying artifacts like Damping Sphere, Grafdigger's Cage, etc. Brotherhood's End, primarily a cheap sweeper that doesn't exile your stuff, while also having value against artifact things, which, while they haven't made a huge resurgence, is something that could come back with Karn being out of the format. This is the number 2 deck in the format. It does struggle a little bit, or has a close matchup against Amolia, rather close matchup against Blue-White Control, relatively close matchup against everything but Lotus Field, basically, so definitely one of the top decks in the format, and people do love to cast their cantrips. Finally, number 1, a deck that has undergone some changes, shall we say. There's a couple variants of Rakdos running around now. Obviously, you still have Rakdos Sack, but that's not really, it's really become its own separate entity. This version really is taking advantage of Smuggler's Copter. There is no Shoulder in this list. Instead, we're a little bit lower to the ground, almost closer to an actual aggressive deck, using Inti Shinashidal of the Sun, or however you pronounce that. Whenever you attack, you may discard a card. Whenever you do, put a +1/+1 counter on target attacking creature. Gains trample until no turn. Whenever you discard 1 or more cards, exile the top card of your library. You may play that card until your next turn. Well, you pair this with the Smuggler's Copter, all of a sudden you have this attack trigger, you have this attack trigger. You can discard 2 cards, exile the top 2 cards of your library, and kind of go nuts from there. Beyond that, you're playing most of the good Rakdos stuff. This person couldn't decide what kill spell they wanted, so you have 1 Bitter Triumph, a couple Heartless Acts, 1 Power Word Kill, 4 Fatal Push, 4 Thoughtseize, and then, 4 Fable, 4 Bone Crusher, 3 Graveyard Passer. The only card you're missing, Shoulder of the Apocalypse, but maybe they were on a bit of a budget consideration, or just simply they wanted to lower to the ground deck with Inti and taking advantage of Kroxa. Now the sideboard, same old, bunch of discard spells, bunch of sweepers for different matchups, whether it be this and Hitsugu. Sometimes you'll see Languish, sometimes you'll see Extinction Event. See Kuligan's Command to help fight against Smuggler's Copter, Reckoner Bankbuster, etc. Rampaging Frostodon as kind of your anti-Amolia tech. 2 copies of Unlicensed Hearse for the graveyard nonsense. Damping Sphere to help out against Phoenix along with your Unlicensed Hearses. So, whole lot of different flexible slots. Amolia has definitely shaken up the format. The banning of Karn helped a little bit, although I don't know how relevant Mono Green would be even if Karn had not gotten banned currently. You still have other decks floating out there. You still have Quintorius Combo. So you have a lot of different decks floating out there that just kind of shook up the format. Just that tiny little bit that the format needed, although I would say in general the top of the format is still kind of largely the same decks. Just the tools they have to play are a little bit different as the format has kind of worked a little bit around them. But once again, if you do like Pioneer content, don't forget to like, comment, subscribe. Hope to see you for our next video, and hope you have a good start to 2024.